David Schultz, and I'm joined here again with Rene. As
Hey
I
there.
mentioned hey Rene, how's it going?
All good? Are you?
Good. Yeah, I'm doing fantastic. So as I mentioned in our little promo video we did, we've had a lot of interest in a lot of questions that have come in regarding the ISA 95 standard. And it's, for this week's podcast, we decided that maybe we should try a different format of an Ask Me Anything. This is the first time that we have done this. So hopefully everything's working out. Our tech support says, yep, everything is good. So it might be a little kludgy at first, but hey, we'll give it a go. And we'll just start answering questions live. So there were quite a few that came in early. I haven't seen any that have shown up here from the live piece itself, but I think we can probably just go ahead and get going, and let's start asking or answering some questions. This is the Ask Me Anything. So if we could just bring up some of the first questions that came in, and we'll start getting at them.
Okay, good.
So now we're waiting for, it should be, here we go. So when is the process segment a useful abstraction over just using equipment? And I look, there's a little more to this question, but I think really what they're trying to understand is how does the standard utilize process segments in an actual production environment? And I could certainly proffer my thoughts on this. But Rene, why don't we go ahead and just start talking about how process segments are utilized within the overall application of ISA 95?
Yeah, good question. Starting with the equipment. Equipment is really describing your, for example, could be a machine, could be a production line with an area on top, or a site or an enterprise. A process segment is really a part of the process that in the end will produce something or will have an activity. But that could be a combination of multiple equipments. A process segment is something that it's product independent, so it's really a process that can have parameters and can be it will have a start and the end. But then when you go to, for example, operations segments, then it's more against a product view. So yeah, process could be a combination of equipment, and process segment can also have dependencies on each other. So you can really say this process always needs to go before this process, can go in parallel with this process. So you can make a real flow out of that.
Yeah, when I read the question, the way I looked at it, going back to where the process segment is, it's defined as it's the smallest unit of work, and it's always going to have some aspect of the resource models there. So it'll be, it'll have material, it'll have equipment, it'll have asset, it'll have personnel that's associated to it. But it's more of a template or a placeholder for, for instance, if I'm a juice factory, it's mixed juice. And that might be the process segment itself, but then I'm going to utilize it for mixing red juice on some particular equipment. That's where it now gets, the instance of it is this operations segment. So I wouldn't say a process segment, understanding the question, something that's used at runtime. When I say runtime, meaning that the operator is actually executing something, but it's used as the placeholder for defining that work that's eventually going to be there in the process. So if you look at the model that we shared last time, I think if you just follow the logical progression of what that looks like, then I think that'll help. And then Rene, as you were saying, when you start stringing multiple process segments that eventually turn into operations segments that are part of your operations definition, an extra, get work, I might need, in order, before I can start mixing juice, I might need to get the raw ingredients to the work center. And then I'm going to mix it, and then I'm going to transfer that finished product into some kind of storage. Those would be three unique process segments, and then in this case would be operations segments.
Yep.
So yeah, fantastic question. Let's see, let's go on to the next one here. So how does the standard distinguish MES and MOM activities? And I think maybe another way to ask this question is, what is the difference between MES and MOM? And, certainly we use those words interchangeably. I think those words they don't mean exactly the same thing, but Rene, thoughts?
Yeah, good one, because we always use it, or it's often used throughout each other. How do you call it? It's so in the old days, it was always MES. MOM is really something that came up later on. How I always see it is that MES is really the execution part, the production execution part of the MOM. So MOM is like a bigger scope. It also includes, for example, maintenance and quality and inventory management. MES is really focused on the execution of it and of production. So it's like a smaller portion of the MOM domain.
Yeah, to me, it's the MES is when somebody hits the button. We're actually doing something. Where the MOM is, we're looking back at it's the like it's the part 3 activity models of all the the pieces that go into it. But mostly, it's what are we planning to produce and what did we actually produce, and then how does that inform us of what it is we're going to do later. So I would say MES is MOM is that broader piece of what includes MES, which is the actual execution of the work. I think that's a pretty good way to look at that. So
it's also a bit in the abbreviation, the manufacturing execution system and the manufacturing operations management. So it's more like a broader topic.
Yeah, there's actually a follow-up, and why does this distinction matter? I don't know that there's a whole lot of reason why it does, but I think it's more just important to understand that there are differences there. And I don't know if you had any further comments on that second follow-up question there, Rene, or why does it matter?
Oh, why does it matter? Yeah. No, I think it's as long as you have the same understanding, it's okay, right? And I use more MOM because then you really have the total scope. Especially with ISA-95, it's covering the whole MOM layer. So that's what I use most. But like I said, MES, it's used more often, I think, by most people.
Yeah, I always think of MES as the software, if you will, that's going about doing the thing that's the MOM piece. But I don't know. There's 6 ways to Sunday. You could look at the difference, but I think it's important to understand it's most of the time we use them interchangeably, but they don't have to be. So,
Yep.
All right. Let's see. Ooh, fantastic question that just came in live here. So how should businesses start modeling their existing operations to conform with ISA-95? Ooh, it's applying the standard. As I always like to say, ISA-95, you don't really read it, you apply it, or you consume it, or you do something with it. But how should they go about doing that, Rene? I think this really gets into some of what we do on a regular basis.
Yeah, it's always the start is always the most difficult part, right? It's I think it's important as a consultant to first really understand the business, so the business processes, things like a material flow, the process flow, to get that understanding. Okay, what are we producing? How are we using it? What is your manufacturing IT landscape? So it's always a bit broader to get that knowledge about the company, because every company is different. The manufacturing IT landscape is always different. So you have to know that a bit more in detail. Then I think it's important. Okay, you have like a big strategy, but in this case you have maybe a use case. So you have something very specific that you want to model out. Then you start with that piece, and I think that's the beauty also of ISA-95 is that you can start with actual information without having the planned or the scheduled information. I would also always start with the resource models first. So look at, okay, do you want to have material, personal equipment, physical assets? What do you have in scope for this particular use case or project? Then you start looking at, okay, do I need to have my operations definitions? Do I need to have my scheduling? Do I want to have my actual performance information? How do we need to communicate between the different systems in the manufacturing IT landscape? That's all, in the end, giving the right scope. Then you have that scope, then you can really do it piece by piece. And you can build it, you can make it bigger and bigger. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's like many things. You want to start small and then grow into it. It's defining the use case is something that we all really understand what it is we're trying to do here. So it's the classic, how do we eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Same type of thing.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. Let's do resource models first, or what is it we're trying to do? But one of the things that we'll often take a look at is what's the actual process workflow. We'll call it an event storm, or what are all the little steps that it actually takes to do the thing we're trying to do? What is the use case that exists there? And then as you start building out all those various activities that are associated with it, then you can start applying, okay, that would be a material piece, or that would be some equipment. Or now we're going to have different process segments because we can really call this thing a unique, a unit of work, so to speak, type of thing
Yeah.
in there. So,
Yeah, and I
but
think what you see often in a project is that you start with equipment because that's very familiar and you can see it and it's known by the people. And then you go into materials. And for example, with materials, you can ask yourself, okay, where do I get my definition data from? But also, do I have recipe information that's really process and product dependent information? Or do I get all my information I need for my order? And then I don't have, for example, a work master, but I get everything from the scheduled order. So that kind of decisions where to start modeling is really depending on the project and business.
okay. Yeah, great question. It's always the, how do we get going with things, and where do we start? And it's one of those, yeah, just jump in. So I think we
Yeah.
got another question coming in. Is value stream mapping helpful with this as a start? So a follow up, what we were just talking about is how do businesses start? Can we start doing value stream mapping? So value stream mapping is where you take a look at all the things that, as we're manufacturing, we'll just say that we're a widget manufacturer. What are all the things that go into manufacturing that widget, whether it's materials or it's energy, or there's some sort of manufacturing process that goes into it? Where does the value increase as it goes from these raw materials coming in to finished goods at the back end of the plant? So that's the value stream map. Would that be something that could be helpful for modeling the use case?
Yeah, I worked with some consultants that are actually also doing that. So yes, they start with a value stream mapping and then go into more the modeling side. For myself, I mostly focus on process flows and material flows. So it's pretty close to that, but that's where I normally start. But
And
yes, to answer, yes, it can really help as a start. Yeah.
yeah, I found value stream mapping more as it's a higher level. It's more of an abstraction than the actual
Yeah.
process, because value stream mapping, it's just now we're it's sort of all the things occur at once versus all the little sometimes we show the path to success as this one little line going up, where most of the time it's this back and forth. Value stream mapping is just what I would call as that line, versus what actually happens to make it work. But certainly gets you in the right ballpark for sure. So great question.
I think it's something also a bit more maybe on the front end. So I always see like a project. You have a project where you need to solve, for example, a use case, but then the whole phase before already happened, like making a strategy, having the business drivers clear. So the whole why of a project. Why do we need to have the project, and where do we find all the value? I think that's all in that phase before. So and
Mm-hmm.
their value stream mapping helps, of course.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, a lot of things that can occur before we actually get to the implementation of the standard for sure.
Yeah.
But that's all part of the things we want to talk about before we get going there. So, all right. I know there's some more questions that came in ahead of the podcast, people that weren't able to join us live. So if we could fire off the next one on that. Ooh, great question. Why do we need a work master and a work directive? So now we're in part 4 of the standard, and this is where things really go, huh? I don't get it. It's, to me, it's very abstract, because part 2, we're sort of talking 2 different systems are communicating, and now we're doing some very specific things. So why do we need both a work master and a work directive, Rene?
Yep, good question again. Yeah, it's really on the part 4 indeed. So you could receive like things like recipe information from a level 4. Then it's more the operation definition. Work master, work directive. It's when it's a level 3. The difference between work master, work directive. Work master is really, you can see it as a template. So it's like, okay, to produce this product on a process like this, I have these parameters. You can see it as a sort of a recipe often, but it's not linked to a job order, to an order directly. It's really like a template. And then you can have an order and you can say, okay, now I want to start an order and I want to do that with this workmaster. At that moment, at least that's the best practice. As is how I use it. At that moment, you can create a work directive, and that's like a running copy of your workmaster. So the workmaster is a template. Work directive is something actual, so it's your workmaster copy, but then it's linked to a specific job order and to a job response in the end, and that will go while you're executing. It will go, and it can also be adjusted. So it can say, okay, for this order, because of some things that are happening, and maybe some temperature is higher than normal, so you have to adjust some parameters. You can do that in your work directive. So that's in the end will also be your actual containing your actual parameters and set points. So it's
Yeah,
more
so
versus an actual order.
yeah, if you
Yep.
get into the part 4 of the standard, there's a couple of diagrams. One's going to be what I call the bringing it all together, where it shows you how all those models fit. If you think of work master and work directive, similar to how you think of process segment and operations segment, which is the specific ones, the template, you kind of get the same idea here. But the other one that I really find helpful and meaningful is that actually it's taking your part 3 activity models, and in those activity models, it's overlaying the models that fit there. And that gives you really good a sense of where am I working with this work master? And that's more in the information, just telling you all about how you want to go about doing the work. And then in the work directive, that's more on the execution side. So I think after this, I'll reference those. We'll put some links in there, what I'm talking about, in terms of the image or the in the part 4 of the standard, those 2 examples that I'm meeting there. I think that'll be very helpful. So.
Yep.
Looks like we got another question that just dropped in here. Said, how do you model equipment or assets that can be used for multiple different roles or processes? So it's the concept of mobile equipment. That comes in a lot. It's a common question that I think usually is asked in the context of, boy, there's a lot of rigidity in the standard. I might have a flexible manufacturing line where the example I always use is I might be making ice cream sandwiches. Sometimes I'm using liquid milk. Sometimes I'm using powdered milk, and I have equipment that moves around. So how do we handle those types of things, Rene?
Yeah, I see 2 things in this question. If the question is how do you model equipment that can be used for multiple processes, then I'm thinking more about you have a process segment that's representing the process, and you can link that to equipment. So that also means a process you can link to multiple equipment. So there you can make that distinction. If you talk about multiple roles or mobile equipment, then what you often see is that there's an area or a production line created that's not an actual production line, but it's like called mobile something. So it's like an area or a production line that's specific for mobile equipment, and then there you have your mobile equipment under it in your equipment hierarchy.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I think if there was one project we were working on where there was a whole lot of equipment that it could have gone through. So if we look at this, this work center, there were a lot of work cells that were associated with it, but for a particular product, they didn't necessarily have to go through all of those. So when you think about, there might have been 30 different cells that it could have traversed, but it only for this particular product we're making, it only needs to hit maybe 15 of those, so half of them. To me, that's a lot like your mobile equipment, where sometimes I'm using things, I'm using and I'm not, and that's just really where you get into that work master and that the work directive, really handles that a lot. Then, of course, you also get into your hierarchy scope, which I know is a question that came in earlier, but that's how we start then defining during this production, this is where this piece of equipment was, this is what it's doing, and we're going to exchange that information based at that level.
Yeah.
So, anything else that you want to add on? I mean, this is a complex question, I would say, or the answer, certainly to really understand the standard and how to apply it, but very doable for sure.
Yeah, you also have the difference between the equipment hierarchy and the hierarchy scope, where you can have different views or hierarchies on your same equipment. I always see the equipment hierarchy itself, that's really physical. And there you have your mobile equipment as well as a could be like a physical line or area. If you go to your hierarchy scope, there you can have a different view on it. And so also for your mobile equipment, you can put it in a different hierarchy if needed.
Yeah, absolutely. We see the same thing with like portable equipment. I might have a cart where the parts that I've picked are going to be on a particular cart. We'll run into that as lots. So sometimes, depending on the application, it can be modeled as the mobile equipment, not necessarily as role-based equipment, if that makes sense. So, another great question that came in. Sometimes it makes more sense to model aspects that don't conform to ISA-95. What part of the standard do you see manufacturers not apply, and why? I know there was a question that came in earlier very similar to this, of asking for some of the other way, do you have to apply the entire standard for an application? So I think we could probably knock both of those out. So what do you think, Rene?
To answer to that last question, no, you can really implement a part of the standard. It's you have the full standard, but you can pick parts of it. Of course, it's all related to each other. So if you want to use it, you need to implement that part or to model that part. If I look at the first part of this question, sometimes it makes more sense to model aspects that don't conform to ISA-95. So what I saw in the past, I often was modeling something, and then I was also thinking, I need something, but it's just not fitting in the standard. Maybe I can bend it a bit, or when do you bend the standard? But in almost all cases, I had to came back to that. So that it was better to follow the standard after all. So now I'm really trying to stick to the standard because there's a reason for how it's all structured. A lot of good people with a lot of experience thought about it, and yeah, it always comes back at you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and that last part, what part of the standard do you see manufacturing not apply? For example, the capability model, that's I never use it in a project actually. So I also know a bit less about it because it's just very often not applicable or not. We don't use it that much, but actually it could be of good value. But until now we never used it. And also, of course, the production domain is much more used than the maintenance or the quality or the inventory in the projects I'm involved in, at least.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I was going to say we've had a lot of conversations within RISE around, boy, I just have not run across an application where we couldn't use the standard. So I would just, go back and say, well, are you sure you can't make it fit? And the reason why I like it is because it's a great abstraction. No matter what it is that you're manufacturing, you're always going to have the resource models. You're always going to have process segments and definitions and all the, the part 4 parts of all the work that goes into it. I'd be hard pressed to find one. That said, the standard continues to evolve. I know that, from its first implementation or when it's first published, there have been several revisions to it. I know part 2, which is the very one that most people are familiar with. I believe that there was a 2013 revision. There was a 2018 revision. And I know that within the ISA, there's even things that we have submitted of this needs to be updated to the standard. So if it doesn't fit, let's take a look and understand why it doesn't fit or why we don't think it fits. And then let's say, is there a way that we could now start implementing something along those lines of I'm trying to remember the last one that we did. It was something related to a work calendar on do we need versioning of that, I think was what it was. So.
Yeah, I think it's also important to have a sort of not one person, but multiple person with ISA-95 experience that you can really brainstorm, and because the standard is can be abstract and open for interpretation on certain topics. So I think it's good to discuss it with multiple peoples, discuss the pros and the cons, and like we have also aligned to the committee itself. So sometimes we ask questions there, or we do proposals even to maybe improve the standard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of networking. If we don't know how we can utilize it, there's plenty of resources available to really everybody that could, how do we utilize it here? Because we certainly want it to succeed. It's a great language for how, start using the common things. Great question. Next one, is data modeling for equipment part of the standard? And then what attributes to include in an extruder machine, for example? So Rene.
Thinking what attributes to include in extruder. Yeah, that's more the business. Yeah, so the ISA-95 is just talking about how to structure your data. But for example, properties for an equipment or attributes, it's completely open. So I think the goal of the standard is to be fully flexible and to cover as much different businesses and segments that can be covered. So it's not really saying what kind of attributes you should include for a specific machine. But the data modeling for equipment, yes, that's part of the standard. So there is an equipment hierarchy. An equipment has a couple of default attributes, but that's more like it has an ID, it has a name, it has a label, it has a description, that kind of stuff. But then the properties is fully open to decide on yourself.
Yeah, so we've done some work with several extrusion companies. So, there's the equipment that's that work center. There's actually going to be quite a bit of equipment that's part of it. Oftentimes there's a blender that's going to be, blending the resins that go into it. Then there's the actual extruder portion itself. That's where you're going to see a lot of temperatures. So for me, it's the properties that you're going to apply to this is going to be things on your die temperatures, and you're going to have recipe set points. You're going to have actual set points. Because the idea, a lot of what we're doing around manufacturing operations management in the KPIs we look at, we're comparing plan versus actual, what we thought we were going to do and what we actually ended up doing type of thing. So I'm just thinking aloud on this in terms of the properties that you would apply in there on that equipment. There's in terms of an extruder, there's going to be a lot of temperatures, mostly on the zones as you're going through that piece of equipment itself. The use case itself, what it is we're trying to do, that's going to inform what properties are there. The beauty of the standard is that if we come across another use case, we just add in those properties. It's okay. That's where we get into version control in that type of thing. So, yeah, great question in there. So next question that came in, looking for sources of how do we learn and understand the standard. We talked a little bit about this earlier. I can certainly go out and buy the standard and I can read the standard, and I'm probably going to be more confused when I got done with the end. So, what we're asking Rene, or what are some great resources for learning the standard and how to do it and how to apply it? So, a very common book is also an ISA publication. It's Rene and Dennis Brandl. So I think it's called the Road to Integration. Apologies if I didn't get that right. We'll get it corrected certainly in the the chat or in the comments section when we post it. But Rene, what's a great way to learn the standard?
Yeah, so one of the things that Ectobox is mentioning is that Bianca Scholten's book. I also read it. It's a really good book. It's very how do you say, going into the actual pragmatic stuff. It's really about actual processes and try to explain it in a bit more simpler way, less abstract. So I really like that book. I can recommend that. And actually, I think that's called The Road to Integration. But that's, I also have to double check it. But
yeah, right. Yeah, we both have the book, and I could probably run over to my bookshelf and grab it, but we'll make sure we get it right.
Yeah, for the rest, yes, of course, reading the standard, but it's a lot. I did some courses on what was it called exactly? ISA-95 in practice, I think. So it was really that an instructor came to the company I was working at that time and was really giving us some business cases. So some example cases like, okay, I have a bakery and I have this and this kind of processes. And then you needed to start a modeling together. So there was a lot of discussion with that group of people. I think that's the best way to learn, to really start with a group of people that are in the same kind of level, with, of course, an instructor or a more experienced person, and then really get onto it. Because, yeah, you can read a lot, but when you really start modeling, then you start thinking a bit different, I think. And yeah, you need to force that. So I think that's the best way to do it. I don't know internationally, and in the Netherlands where I live, I know there are courses like that. Internationally, I'm not aware how that's exactly where you should go to.
Yeah, there are some resources within ISA itself for those types of things. And just as a preview of coming attractions, we are developing some content around both understanding the standard itself as well as how to apply the standard. We're going to be moving into that here shortly. So you'll see that coming up here sometime later this year is our expectation on that. But we're actually going to start taking some basic use cases and start applying it. But one of the exercises that I take, and Rene, you mentioned this, is if you were to just take a look at a cake recipe on, that you go to the grocery store, you buy your cake mix, whatever it is from your favorite cake mix provider, and you just look at the back and say, how would I apply the standard? What are the resources that are associated with it? What are the process segments that would be associated with it? How would I actually go about applying the standard? And I think you'll discover pretty quickly of, what, this is actually maybe a little bit easier than I thought. So
Yeah.
great way to do it. Just it's by practice. It's like best way to learn how to play golf is just go swing the club.
Yeah.
All right. Another question. Hi, Rene. How do you see ISA-95 adopting to the new Gen AI world and the standard getting reformed in the near future? Ooh.
Yeah, interesting one.
Yeah.
Yeah, to
Yeah. So
start with, I think only ISA-95, I think it can have different models or forms of data combined. For example, with RISE, there's a time series database or different time series that can be combined. So you have the ISA-95 model in graph, where you have everything within objects or entities. And if you then can combine that with time series data, that's very powerful. It's not described in the standard, but of course you can combine that. So that's also how I see this. I think the ISA-95 standard is really for the manufacturing processes and to get that all in a structured way. But then if you talk about big data or time series data, then you could find another solution and then combine that together with ISA-95. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great. I mean, as far as just doing generative AI, is there a way that I could bring in all of the ISA-95 standard, then ask it questions? Certainly it's there. More it's where the value is going to be is in applying the standard, the thing that we do every day. Where could I use some LLM to start saying I'm here's my role, here's what I'm trying to do, here's this stuff that I'm working with. How would I go about applying it? I think you'll start to see some of that. I don't know if the standard's going to evolve for Gen AI. I'm trying to think of what that might look like, but yeah, no, great stuff, because it's that there might be much like workflow is introduced in the 2018 standard. Would there be a Gen AI piece or some sort of AI component where here's how you want to start modeling some of the information so it can be easily consumed by LLMs or getting it prepared? For me, this is the value of the standard, is that I'm dealing with common objects or common data models. So it makes it very easy for data scientists to understand, when I'm looking at, a work directive, I know what that means. I know the things I'm going to expect there. So, All right, cool. I think we can probably get back to some of the questions that came in ahead of time. So let's go ahead and bring up the next one there. Said, does data from level 2 get incorporated into the model? If so, what entities and properties does it attach to? For example, job response data.
Let me think. Yes, of course you can connect with level 2 with the automation layer. It in my opinion is written for level 3, but it's just to have the communication with level 2. So it's linked to the equipment often. You can have, for example, can be equipment properties, and then based on, for example, an equipment state, you can execute some business logic and have some level 3 functionality. Or, for example, you start a job response based on a signal you get on a certain piece of equipment. So often it's linked via equipment. You could even, that's also what I saw earlier, that you combine ISA-95 with ISA-88. And maybe it's a different topic, but also that's possible to combine the standards. It's not easy, but I saw it. I saw it in the past that it's like sort of combined. So you go a couple of levels deeper, and you put that all together. So yes, it's possible, and mostly it's via equipment status. And job response data, that's, for example, data that you want to collect from the automation layer and you want to link it to a job response. A job response is a time period. So it has a start and an end, and you can link equipment to it. You can link material or physical assets or personal to it. But you can also link data directly from the floor or from the automation layer to that job response.
Yeah, so going back to that extruder example that we had, and I'll just throw out a potential use case here. Is, granted, I'm trying to get information from my ERP. So my level 4 system said, I need you to make, and we're going to make some kind of extruded. There's a polymer that we're going to make. That'll go into the level 3 system where we're going to actually execute the order, but there's this recipe we're going to send to that particular line. And this is how much of, as we go through these blenders, there's supposed to be so many pounds of, these various resins that are coming through on these types of things. So the level 2 data is really where we're going to give it those recipe set points, if you will. And then that job response. So those are going to be the actuals of how much did we actually consume. So you don't necessarily integrate the level 2 data into it. However, through those properties that we have in the various models, that's where we're going to start getting some of the the plan versus actual, and this goes into the KPIs we're trying to do. So, I don't know if that's a good example there, Rene, but that's generally how I think of it, is how the level 2 piece comes in.
It's you're right. For example, with consumptions and productions in ISA-95, it's often a material actual where you consume or you produce something. But the data itself, so how much of a product, that could really come from a level 2. It can come from a scale or can come from a process or a PLC. You can get that information, and then you need to link that on the right level, and you fill your actual information, your performance data with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it does get incorporated, not directly, but it's certainly indirectly through the properties that are created. I think it's probably maybe a good way to think about that. So let's see. Let's go on to the next question that came in ahead of time. So we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier. Maybe we can spend a little more time on it. To use the standard correctly, does my model need to include everything?
No, the simple answer is no.
Short answer is no.
No, I did projects where you only have actual data, so no planned data at all. You can have material definitions up front, but also nothing is really mandatory. I mean, you can even have no equipment if you don't need to, if you don't want to track it. So it's completely separated. Of course, often you see that there are orders that's more like the planned or the scheduled, and then you have the performance data against it, but it can be completely separated from each other. And yeah, there's not much that you really need in the standard. You have like the hierarchy in some cases. So if you have, for example, a job response, you need to have it linked to a work response. So some of the things are mandatory, but that's more like up the tree. But for each model, yeah, you're very flexible what to add and what to link.
Yeah, that's the beauty of it. You just add to it. The edge case is the edge case. Put in exactly what you need to get there. I'm a big believer in keep it simple. Don't overcomplicate things, because if you try to make it do everything, you end up getting nowhere. So when you want to be everything, you end up being nothing. So I would say keep it simple, knowing that you can expand out. You can continue to iterate on what you've done as more and more use cases come. And that's why, to us, the standard is so powerful, because it's not a directive, so to speak. It's more, I think, informative is what I'm looking for there. So, yeah. So there's a comment that came in here that I think actually is going to segue into another question that came in, and it's regarding the new ISA-95 Part 1 standard is going to be coming out soon. So you can certainly follow some of the progress there. The last time that standard was published was, I believe, 2010. So Part 1, I would say, is a little out of date. But there was a question that came in earlier, and you don't have to throw it up there. We'll just talk a little bit about it. Oftentimes, when I hear about the automation pyramid, or the what's known as that ISA-95, where we have all the various levels, there's a conversation around, well, it's very restrictive and it forces you to use this point-to-point integration where I have to, it's the DEM bones model of my PLCs have to connect to my SCADA, that has to connect to my MES, and it makes it very restrictive on doing that. And oftentimes that comes out of Part 1. So, I guess the question I'm getting here, Rene, is, does the standard really enforce how you connect all of your systems together? Or is that something where the standard's really just silent about it, and maybe it's a misunderstanding?
Yeah, I think it's. I don't think it's saying that. It's not saying how you should connect it. The only thing is what it's a bit describing. It's how do you separate level 3 from level 4? And so in that automation period, when is something a level 4 application and when is it level 3? So when is it in scope for ISA-95 or not? And I think that's more about, okay, how business critical is it? Then it's more going to level 3.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that's one of that's where it talks about, but it's not describing it exactly. Also there, it's they leave it open to the implementation. Per company can be different. So
Yeah, I mean,
they're not that restricted in my opinion.
Agreed. I mean, to me, it's functional. Sometimes you're at the mercy of what's already there and how you want to exchange that information, and you might be just dealing with some legacy networks. But there's nothing in there that says no, you can't have. I mean, there's nothing that restricts you from getting different systems from connecting together. So, another question that came in from Brian here. It says ISA-95 seems to be incomplete in regards to the lower levels. Level 1 and 2. ISA-88, you referenced that earlier, Rene, is popular model for those levels. How are the two standards combined to provide a complete model? That almost sounds like a whole separate podcast for us, Rene. But
That's
yeah,
right.
So quickly.
Yeah. I know there is a document that is describing how it can work together.
I think it's called TR-8895 or TR-9588. It's from ISA. It's one of the technical reports that's there that talks a lot about doing it, and certainly in our training we speak to how to do those things.
Yeah, but it's also in the ISA-95 standard is also describing that, okay, it's giving you the 5 levels, for example, of your equipment hierarchy, but it's also saying in the small letters like this can be extended if you need to go 1 or 2 levels deeper. So it always keeps like a door a little bit open for that kind of stuff. So yeah, there you can go a level deeper. and that brings you to the ISA 88. But if you talk about whole batch management, that kind of stuff, then you really should go to ISA 88. It's a different world in the end. So yeah, it's hard to answer how to combine everything.
Right.
I would say go to look at that document as well. But it's also about, okay, it's two systems or it could be two different solutions working together. And then as, for example, a data hub, you could say, okay, I get all that information and for example, part of the information like the equipment model, I will have it fully in an ISA-95, for example. But certain things cannot go into ISA-95. That is really ISA-88. So
Yeah, it's where you start getting into some of the control logic is more the ISA-88 domain. So
yeah.
Another question coming in from Ectobox. In your work, are you using mostly parts 1, 2, 3, and not much in the remaining parts?
Yeah, it depends what kind of work. So part 3 I really use for it's describing functionality and activity models. So I use that a lot for documentation. So when you're, for example, writing a user requirement spec or a functional design, then I often use that as a guide. Also to have a sort of a checklist and to say, okay, what kind of the domains are there and what kind of functionality should I categorize in what way. What was I trying to say?
Yeah, I mean, you get to
Yeah.
some of the others like parts 5 and 6. That's just more around, some pub sub architectures or how we want to label messages for some specific applications.
Yeah.
I don't know that it gets used as much, but some of that is, I think, because when we're doing, what I refer to as the data contracts, those are sort of an inherent. We already somewhat know how to do those things. So I can't say we don't use them. Like it's in our video we did around part 3. To me, I think you're already using them. You just maybe not be aware that you're using it. And I would say that at least for those parts, you're probably using it. You just may not realize that you're using it.
Yeah, and I think the part 1 I'm using not that much because it's more about terminology. So I'm using mostly 2 and 4 to look up the different models or entities. And the 2 is more about the interaction between level 3 and 4. And part 4 is more about the level 3 applications, so more on the level 3. So that's what I use a lot to really look at, okay, what are the relations, what are the attributes? And yeah, like I said, the part 3 is really about the functional. So also when you talk about manufacturing IT strategy, as a consultant, sometimes you're really at that level. Then also that part 3 is very valuable because you can have a look at, okay, what's my current IT landscape or OT landscape, and which functionality is covered by which solution. So if you make an overview of that, you see that sometimes maybe an ERP solution is solving some execution things. So it's like, okay, maybe it's better to move that a bit to the right level. So yeah, I find it very valuable, that part 3 for strategy, but also designing on project level to say, okay, where are your requirements and how are we going to meet those?
Yeah, I mean the part 3 takeaway that we did for me was, it's really great for a functional, design. That if I'm trying to document exactly what the thing's supposed to do, go to your part 3 activity models, and that really walks through exactly how do we document what's supposed to happen, how do we execute it, how do we schedule, plan it, those types of things, and finally how did we do on the back end of it. So how do we know we did good? How do we know we didn't do well on that? So.
Yeah.
Let's see. Next question. Does the modeling process ever influence how the production process changes in the future? Or should the standard always be a reaction to the reality, not a prescription of the future?
Yeah, I would say it shouldn't influence it. Because the process is yeah, that's always the truth. That's how it is. That's how people work. But it could be that, for example, what I was saying about that part 3, it could be that you have some level 3 functionality that's now executed by a different system. So, for example, sometimes you see that an ERP system is registering what is actually consumed and produced, and then it's sending it to an MES solution. Or then in my head, that's the wrong way. That's the other way around. Because in my opinion, the lower you are in your level, there is where the real data is coming from. So you have your automation layer, that's the real truth from the floor. And then you have your level 3 layer. Okay, there you can have some business logic. And in the end, there you know how much is consumed and produced. And then that's sent as performance data to level 4. That's like how the normal flow is going. If you see that it's differently at this moment, then it's something that you could investigate, you could challenge maybe, and that could mean a potential change. But that's more like procedural or the way of working. But of course, the real process itself, yeah, that's in my opinion, we should always be a reaction to that. So we should model it.
Yeah, that one sometimes, when I get into software, to me it's always we do things the way we do it because that's the way we've always done it, so to speak. There's a great story that I'll share about, a reason why a mom always cuts the end off of her ham, and it's because going back a few generations, it's because that's the only way her great grandmother could get it to fit in the pan. So, for me, it's understanding is when you're starting to do these things, if there's a way to change up your workflow that in my mind's eye makes it easier to apply it, I would certainly take a look at it because you'll probably get some efficiencies out of that as well. So I would say maybe it influences how you're doing it, but certainly shouldn't be more the directive of like, we're not going to completely redo our thing just to make it fit the standard. So
yeah, and often asking the right questions can also be challenging the current status, right? So, for example, when you get every order is always sending how you should execute, what kind of parameters, but maybe part of that data is always the same for a specific process. Then that's also something that could be sent once or could be configured once as a process segment or something like that. And then you don't have to send it each time with your order. So
yeah.
that kind of stuff could be that it's like that because it always was that way. But taking that, and that's often part 3 that we're using then. It's like, okay, we see this and you can challenge it. Like, okay, maybe we can do it differently. So yeah, it's more about less about modeling and more about the part 3, the functionality map.
Agreed. All right. Another question that came in earlier is something very, very specific. So, what is the difference between the equipment hierarchy model, the hierarchy scope model, and the equipment model? They all kind of sound the same to me. What's the difference?
Yeah, good question. The equipment hierarchy model, that's the hierarchy of your physical equipment. So that's like enterprise, site, area, work center, work unit. And your equipment model, that's described in part 2. So that's like how it's all working together, how you have your relationship, which attributes, and you use your equipment model to make your equipment hierarchy model. So your equipment model is how can you configure or how can you model your equipment piece by piece, but then you link a certain piece of equipment, you link that to another equipment, like with an is part of relation, for example. So with a parent-child relation, and that's how you build your equipment hierarchy model. So there can also be only one equipment hierarchy model. And then you have hierarchy scope model. That's how I see it, at least, because there are some discussions around it, but it's like an alternative hierarchy on your equipment model. So that's also how we now within RISE use it. You can have an equipment hierarchy, but then you can have a hierarchy scope that's, for example, representing a business view of your equipment. So, or what we, for example, during one of the last projects, we use it for work centers in ERP to model that, because it's in a different way. It's not equipment, but still we want to link it to equipment. So with that way, we created a hierarchy scope, and we link it to the right equipment. And at the same time, you can also create a hierarchy scope for everything where you want to limit the scope. So for example, when you have a work calendar definition, you can say, okay, I don't limit the scope. It's the same for all. But you can also say, no, this one is purely for this part of my plant, or part of my company. So I limit it to this piece of the hierarchy scope. And with that, you can link it to a specific set of equipment. And it doesn't have to be the same layer as the equipment hierarchy. It can be like a certain type of machine can be linked in that way. So you create an alternative hierarchy with that hierarchy scope.
So it's more of the dynamic part of, the hierarchy is, this is the rigid piece, the equipment, I wouldn't call it the rigid piece. I don't want to, use the misnomer there saying it's rigid, but hierarchy scopes gives you a little bit of flexibility. I think the standard defines that it's where the information is exchanged, or the level, meaning the equipment level of where it's going to be exchanged, but gives you a little bit of flexibility when you actually get into things, because as we all know, manufacturing does not conform to that rigid piece. And so that this is that it's kind of like in the equipment, is that has to be, enterprise site, area, work center, work unit, unless you want to call it something else, then that's okay too. So it's, I always thought that was kind of funny. It's always the back door to everything. So,
yeah, you often need different views on the same equipment, and that's what was in the beginning. I think in the beginning of the standard, it was not in. That was also a lot of criticism was on that, and with that hierarchy scope, you can really create those alternative views.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question just popped in. Which Part 2 data models are you using? When implementing UNS, only equipment model, or also other material models, etc. So for people that aren't familiar with UNS, that is the unified namespace. That is, some people will refer to as an architecture or an approach. So there's certainly a definition there, but in terms of modeling Part 2, you can certainly bring in all of that information, can be modeled in UNS. Just understand, from our perspective, UNS is really more looking at what I would call the level 2, or the operations view of the business. So we were talking earlier about that hierarchy scope. There's different perspectives that people are going to want to have on data. To me, you can implement all of the Part 2 models, lots and sublots that are part of material, for your resource models. That said, I don't know that there's a lot of, I've not seen any of the UNS approaches that actually use, I would call them the object models themselves. I think they're referenced uniquely in there. So I'm going to have that equipment hierarchy. I'm going to have, say, materials that are on it. I'm going to have personnel that are associated with it. There are, the equipment, of course, is built in there, and there might be assets that are associated with that. But generally, there's something that are very bespoke. So Rene, I don't know how much familiarity or that you have with this UNS over in Europe. From my perspective, it's very much in the US where I run across it more, but we're seeing it more and more.
Yeah, I think it's used a lot, but maybe not called UNS that much. But yeah, it's a very interesting topic. It's what a lot of companies are looking for, to get that unified namespace in your company.
We did a whole podcast on just defining the UNS and what that looks like. But in terms of the models, it's certainly something that we're exploring. For us, there's more that needs to be there for the UNS, to be valuable, but certainly an event-driven architecture where we're exchanging data models. Absolutely, tremendous value in doing that. So I'd certainly look into that approach for sure. So, All right. Well, it looks like we are at the top of the hour. I know there were a couple other questions that came in earlier that we'll try to get back to. But like I said at the very beginning, this was our first foray into doing an Ask Me Anything, something something live where we just come in and it's almost the Ask the Experts, if you will, which is why I'm glad Rene was gracious enough to join. With that, if there's other topics that you'd like to understand more about or something you think would be very meaningful or helpful for to understand how do we utilize, how do we improve, how do we advance our manufacturing and then the data that goes along with that and the systems that's there, let us know and we'll certainly explore future topics. So Ken, Rene, thank you so much for joining. Everybody who was able to join us live, thanks for being here. Great questions that were asked, and we'll certainly use those to inform how we want to do things in the future. So enjoy the rest of your day, evening, morning, whatever it's
It
like.
was good actually, yeah, because I didn't know what to expect, but it was really nice questions, so very interactive. So thanks
Sometimes it's
everybody.
always stump the expert, ask the question they can't ask. So thank you, everybody. So it's good stuff.
Okay.